The day is finally here as NBA free agency is upon us, and the time has come for the Sixers to build out a championship roster. We have some great news to work with as there continues to be more and more smoke attaching the Sixers to Paul George in a potential max contract situation. Now, essentially where we're at this point, I'm recording this shortly before free agency tips off. I did not want to wait for a reaction video because we do not know the time in which Paul George will ultimately make his decision, as we do have the news that Paul George is set to meet with both the Clippers and the Sixers, and Evan Sideri adds via Shams Charania that George's primary focus is currently on either staying in Los Angeles or going to Philadelphia. So it is no secret that Paul George has been option A for the Sixers team, and for good reason. I know he is not the perfect basketball player, but he is the perfect link between a Tyrese Maxey and a Joel Embiid, and also keeps options open for the Sixers to continue to build. And it does seem the Sixers are very much leaning into that direction. As we get this report here, this coming from Ian Bagley here, who writes that one other note as we get close to free agency, the Philadelphia 76ers are in on Paul George, as we all know. In the hours before free agency, the Sixers were exploring ways to create more cap space to add players beyond just George, per people familiar with the matter. Among many ways they can do this, by waiving a player whose salary is not guaranteed for 24-25. So essentially what that is writing there is that Paul Reed will not be on the Sixers team next year, as his contract is non-guaranteed. They did officially rescind the qualifying offer for Terquavion Smith and waive Jeff Doughton. They declined the team option there. So there are some moves being made around the edges, and that is with the intention of pulling in another big fish beyond just Paul George. And we did get this report here that I do think is worth bringing up from Mark Stein here, who writes, the 76ers have explored the possibility of adding both Paul George and Kentavious Caldwell-Pope in free agency. It is time for things to happen. Now, I don't see too much of a real chance with that happening with KCP, and primarily because of the fact that both Paul George and Kentavious Caldwell-Pope have been mentioned with a lot of the same teams, and most specifically here, I'm talking about the Sixers and the Magic, who are teams looking to overpay to bring in these win-now pieces and take that next step. Now, how I honestly seeing this playing itself out, I think Paul George makes his decision. I do think it is to play in Philadelphia, and I think Kentavious Caldwell-Pope ultimately gets a better offer and signs with the Orlando Magic there. But that does not mean bad news for the Sixers. For starters, that Paul George is the prize of this, and just to talk about him a little bit, he's still a guy that is a 22.6 point per game scorer, 5 rebounds, a 61% true shooting percentage, 68.5% effective field goal percentage on 5 catch and shoot free throw attempts per, or field goal attempts per game, one of the most efficient off-ball scorers, elite impact metrics, underrated playmaker, solid ISO efficiency, and deflections galore. Despite the injury and age concerns, he's still the crown jewel of this free agent. Spot on from NBA University there, and that is the biggest selling point, that these supplementary skills, these complementary abilities that he can add around Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid is what this Sixers team is looking for. That Paul George as your future star, as your number one guy, is not the answer, that you're not winning a championship that way. But Paul George as a true number 3. And when you do think about the Clippers' shortcomings, while Paul George, has not been a model citizen or model player in everything here, he's not been the reason that they've been lost. It has been much more about the health of guys like Kawhi Leonard, who has been unable to go through a playoff run with the Clippers. And even with Joel Embiid, who these concerns certainly fall on as well, at least Joel is out there and battling. Like, we've seen so many opportunities in which Kawhi Leonard is just straight up unavailable. And I don't mean that as a significant slight on him, but the facts are the facts that man is not on the floor. And I do think Paul George is getting sick of it to an extent, and that's why we're having these conversations. Now, when speaking about the outside of Paul George options, one of the biggest driving forces for why this is the clear-cut best option for the Sixers is you keep all options open, that you just straight up sign Paul George on this contract without having to give up any of our draft picks, any of our assets, and still having a little bit of money to play with. To take a look at kind of the cap space situation now, shout out to Austin Krell for this. So not fully updated as there is no Adam Bona contract yet, but there's a little bit to look at for what Embiid's making, what Maxey's making, what we have for Jared McCain. And again, Paul George is going to change this drastically, but there is still some wiggle room. Now, if we want to think absolute dream situation here, say Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, that he does take that money. Maybe he isn't as interested in competing, which, by the way, I'm not fully ruling out. But I do think that there's a chance that KCP, who already has 2 rings on his finger, maybe he still has that hunger to contend for a championship. I think it's tough to dispute that Philadelphia is not a better opportunity than a team like the Orlando Magic. But say that is the case, that he does make his way down to Orlando. There is one other intriguing option on the table, and that's Lauri Markkanen from the Utah Jazz. Now, this is not a realistic option. This certainly falls more in the pipe dream category, but it is possible for these Sixers to add all 4 with Lauri Markkanen, Paul George, Tyrese Maxey, and Joel Embiid. Now, Derek Barnard did a really nice job breaking this down with the salary cap implications. It would be some hoops these Sixers are jumping through. That they would have $15 million in space under the second apron with 4 players under contract. They'd be a second apron team every year. Forget signing buyout guys. Forget being aggressive. Forget aggregating salaries. Forget pretty much any move you can make. It would be those 4 stars and 11 minimums every year. Now, I don't know if that's the direction you want to go, but I do think there are ways to backtrack out of that. Like, say you bring in Lauri and Paul George for a year and it's not working out, you can make a decision and ship one off for a ton of draft picks and kind of rebuild there. I think Lauri is obviously the more appealing for franchises around the league. I think Lauri's one of the more underrated players in the sport. That I do think the guy is a real deal all-star and a guy that you can build a team around to an extent, which I think Utah is trying to do, but ultimately, like, not fully buying into the way that I think. And I do think he would be a perfect fit around Joel Embiid. We'd be talking about 2 high-volume three-point shooters at the forward positions, Lauri providing a little bit of that rebounding help, which Paul George will already be better than a guy like Tobias Harris. But the bottom line is there's still things that can be done. This offseason has been sold as the vision for Daryl Morey. That so much of his time in Philadelphia has been setting up for this. So now the starting point is off. The race is going, and we're about to see what he ultimately is going to put together here. And with Paul George specifically, I do want to talk a little bit about him leaving Los Angeles. For most of this offseason, I won't lie, I thought it was a little bit more of a pipe dream. That I thought this was a situation where he was using these Sixers as leverage, and I don't think that is the worst thing in the world, but I do think as a franchise, you should still want your name recognized and mentioned among the bigger stars as a place they're considering. That's still an appealing factor to me, so if that was ultimately how things played out, I wouldn't have been that mad about it, but ultimately, we're seeing some real deal interest, and the bigger conversation point here has been the money. That has always been the Sixers' selling point, that we have a full-scale max contract waiting for you, wanting for you to sign. And by the way, quick shout out to Tyrese Maxey for that even being available, as the trust that Tyrese Maxey has shown in the Sixers organization has allowed this to be the case. That Maxey was extension eligible last offseason. Just about every player in his shoes, and particularly when a clutch client of Rich Paul, who is Tyrese Maxey's agent, just went through a whole firestorm with Ben Simmons during his exit. But Tyrese Maxey still showed this good faith, put it off until this summer, and still will sign it at the tail end of this summer after the Paul George or max contract or whatever free agent moves are done. And that works in the order of operations because of his cap hit. He counts as $13 million right now. He's going to be getting way more than that when everything is said and done, and deservingly so. But for the Sixers specifically, it is shout out to Tyrese Maxey for that being a part of this being available. And it is shout out to Paul George for ultimately standing on business a little bit here. That there was so much talk about he wanted that 4th year. That was a huge selling point, and the Clippers had drawn that line in the sand that you're not getting a true max contract, which they did not give to Kawhi Leonard, and we're not giving you that 4th year. That was the talking point. That was the sticking point, and the Sixers were that option. Well, the Clippers refused to go above that and thought he was bluffing, that this guy does not want to leave Los Angeles, and Paul George is looking like he's really considering it. Now, we do know we got these meetings. Again, I don't think this is going to be a crazy long meeting. I think the decision should more or less be made in Paul George's head. Maybe the Clippers pony up and pay extra money is the only way that I do see this happening where he does not leave Los Angeles. But there's a lot of tea leaves pointing in the Sixers' direction. From Joel Embiid getting on the pregame show and giving him a little side-eye look. From Paul George's wife now following Joel Embiid's wife on Instagram. There's a lot of these little things that are adding up to really look like things could be happening. So as free agency kicks off, it's time to buckle up and see what happens. This Sixers team, while I understand the frustration, I understand the lack of playoff success, they're not as far off as probably the perception of it is. You add Paul George, you still have Tyrese Maxey, you still have Joel Embiid, you just added a young talent in Jared McCain. You keep those 5 first-round picks or 4 first-round picks that you can trade off and add more win-now pieces, and you still have a little bit of money to work with. And by the way, Sixers still looking to clear more cap space, so that number could even change a little bit more. The Sixers are in a great spot to start free agency here. Paul George is still the selling point. That is the number one option, the guy, the direction that the Sixers need to build this around. But you start there and move on, and the Sixers are sitting pretty. So I'm feeling great about how this is about to go. Make sure that I will do having some reaction videos when we do know what the decision is for Paul George, but I did want to dive into these routes and break this down particularly. I do think Paul George happens, and I will be hopping on live tomorrow night to talk a little bit right here on Sixers Digest, so make sure to tune in for that. Smash that subscribe button if you have not already to make sure you're staying posted for. Drop a like on this video and any comments you have below. If there are any players that you want me to take a look at that I would love to dive deeper in, Najee Marshall is a guy that is a favorite of mine as a role player target. There's a couple others that I do want to be diving into on this channel, but I'd love to hear your comments, any names that you want to throw out to round out this roster. Maybe an Eric Gordon could be a potential name that I think could make some sense for the Sixers. I'm going to dive into all that and more. We are just hitting the starting point of the Sixers off season, so buckle up, everybody. There's a lot to go down, and I'll be with you from start to finish here on Sixers Digest. Peace.